Hey guys, so the audio messed up in this first clip, but basically what I'm saying here is I'm just here with a video showing you how I made the dress for my Meteion cosplay, and that I've also listed the patterns I made for this on my store Envy and Etsy. Both are linked down below. So anyways, on to the list of materials you will need. You will need some kind of light blue fabric. This fabric that I used for this cosplay was actually a bed sheet that I got for like $1 or so from a local thrift store, and I think it worked out pretty well. So I assume any sort of cottony fabric will work just fine for this. You don't want anything with stretch in it though. You also need some snaps for this costume to use both here at the collar as well as on the sleeves, and you'll need some buttons as well, also in a kind of light bluish color. You also need some thin bias tape in a similar light blue color. I believe the bias tape I used was about 1/2 inch wide. And you'll need some thin elastic here. I believe this elastic was 2/3 to 1/2 inch wide. And then of course you'll need thread, scissors, a sewing machine, sewing needle, sewing pins, all your typical sewing supplies. If there's anything I missed, there will be a list down in the description below that will include that, but I think I have everything covered, so now we can get on to the crafting. I started off by creating my patterns and making a mock-up. To do this, I traced around an oversized t-shirt dress that I already owned to get the basic shape and length of Meteion's dress. I traced that onto fabric that I used to make mock-ups, which is just a thrifted bedsheet. After that, I went ahead and made any adjustments that I knew I would need to make straight off the bat, such as widening the waist so that I'd have more fabric to gather later and creating a V at the neckline. I also went ahead and drew up the rest of the pattern pieces, like the sleeves and the collar. These were pieces that I've drawn up quite a bit, so I just used previous experience to figure out how to pattern these pieces. Like, I was very used to drawing up sleeve patterns and drawing up collar patterns because of previous cosplays. The next part wasn't recorded, but I just quickly stitched everything together and used a wide stitch length to do this, and then tried it on to make sure my mock-up fit and to make any further adjustments. It was a lot of sewing things together, trying it on, marking the adjustments, cutting or seam ripping, and then re-sewing, trying it on again, etc., which is why I didn't record it. It's just a lot of back and forth and really annoying to record when I'm just trying to get through it. By the way, I should probably clarify in case anyone doesn't know what a mock-up is, but a mock-up is basically just a practice run of your garment. Usually your actual garment is made out of more expensive, nicer material, given mine was a bedsheet the same as my mock-up material, but obviously my bedsheet has limited material, so I couldn't make them both out of this blue material. But anyways, the mock-up is a practice run on cheaper material so that you can try everything on, see if it's working the way that you want it to work, and if it's not, you can draw over your mock-up, make any adjustments, hack and cut away whatever pieces you need until it finally looks the way that you want to look, and then take it all apart and use it as your pattern. Once I was happy with how the mock-up looked, I took it apart to get my pattern pieces, and then I cut those pieces out in my actual material that my Meteion dress would be made from, which is this blue bedsheet. My mock-up didn't account for seam allowance in some areas, so I made sure to leave seam allowance when cutting out my fabric in those areas. The only piece that I didn't cut out was the neck piece, and that is because the easiest way for me to create the pleated neck piece was to pleat the fabric first and then cut out my pattern, which didn't account for pleating. It's just a V-shaped pattern piece with no pleating to it whatsoever. So I took a long section of my blue fabric and started pleating it. I made these pleats 1.5 inches wide in order to keep them uniform and even. I marked a ton of lines that were 1.5 inch apart across the length of my fabric. Then I took every third line and pulled that forward to the line in front of it, so the second line, and pinned it down to create the pleat. And then that third line that I had just pulled forward now becomes the first line, so I skip the second and then go to the third after that and then pull that forward to the second line. Hopefully this paired with the video makes sense. I didn't know how many I'd need either, so I just did a fairly like large area of my fabric and would hold up my pattern piece as I went along until I had finally pleated enough to cover my pattern piece and then some. Make sure that you're making the pleats long enough or tall enough to cover your pattern piece as well, so just have quite a bit of like excess around the pleats. I used fabric chalk, by the way, to mark the lines so that I could brush off any that I didn't end up any from the fabric that I didn't end up using later, and I didn't like permanently ruin the fabric or waste any. In the end, once I had pleated enough pleats to fill the neck area, I ended up not actually using the neck pattern piece for anything other than a size reference. Instead, I cut out a rough square around the V-shaped piece, making sure to account for both halves, by the way, because the neck piece does need to be placed on a fold, so you need to make sure to account for that if doing it this way. Then I took that piece and laid my dress on top of it, pinning it into place, making sure everything laid flat, not cutting away any of the excess yet. After that, I quickly pinned together the body of the dress and tried it on. This is because I realized that I had to account for boobs, so to make sure that all of the pleats stayed laying flat on me and didn't just start to pull open and like unpleat because of my chest, like trying to go around it, I tried it on and then unpinned and repinned the neckline and the pleats until I was happy with it and the pleats actually laid flat. In the end, this was a good decision because I did end up needing a larger piece and a bit more room than the original V-shape pattern that I had made. I recommend doing this as well to ensure that everything fits correctly and sits correctly on you. It's just a little bit of fabric that will get wasted, but nothing big, and you'll get the correct fit and have the pleats actually stay pleated looking. I want to note that I also folded over and ironed down the raw edges of the neckline on the body of the dress in order to make pinning the neck piece into place a whole lot easier. Next, it was finally time to sew it together via a top stitch. After that, I ironed everything in order to remove the pins while making the pleats keep their shape. After sewing the pleats into place, I went ahead and sewed the front and back pieces together, sewing them together at the shoulder seams and only one side seam. I left the other one open. Then I ironed and pressed those seams open. I also want to make sure I note that when you are sewing them together, make sure that the right sides of the fabrics are placed together so that you're sewing on the wrong side of the fabrics. And one last thing, at this point I've also cut away the excess pleated fabric. Again, didn't record this. I think I might have, but I lost part of this footage at one point and I didn't get that back. I only have what I have in this video. So I did cut off the excess of the pleats, and then I used my serger to just sew around the entire edge of the pleated area, even across the top of the neckline, just to keep everything from fraying and make it look a little bit nicer. Now it was time to start working on the collar. My first step was to trace my patterns using fabric chalk onto my fabric, including tracing around my embroidery template. Don't cut this piece out yet, by the way, or these pieces. Instead, place the traced area into the center of an embroidery hoop and pull your fabric tight-ish. Like, you want it to not be like overly stretched, but you want it to be pretty snug and not loose or anything. I also stitched around the edges of the embroidery hoop to keep the fabric in place, because this fabric does like to shift and I want to be able to like pick it up and move it around in order to sew on the embroidery pattern. I said fabric chalk, but it's a pencil, but it's similar to fabric chalk because you can just brush it away later. But anything that's good for marking fabric, use it here. After that, I took some embroidery floss and an embroidery needle and started embroidering the collar piece following the lines that I had drawn on. I'll be honest and say that I don't really know what I'm doing when it comes to embroidery. I just kinda know the basics, I think, from what I've seen from like those DIY TikTok-like videos or 5-minute crafts videos or whatever. And that happened to be good enough for this project, but I basically just sewed a line of backstitch-like stitches along each line that needed to be embroidered, making sure to not pull the stitches too tight in order to avoid gathering the fabric, and I tried my best to keep them uniform in length. I added iron-on interfacing to the inside of the embroidered collar pieces. Then I sewed the side seams together on both the outer embroidered collar piece and what would be the inner lining collar piece. So there's like two collars that you're making, but you're going to sew those together later so that you don't see all of the inner embroidery and the interfacing when you're wearing the garment. Next, I pinned the collar to the neckline of the dress. I pinned this so that the outer collar was placed right sides together with the dress and upside down, and then the inner collar or lining piece was placed right side of the collar to wrong side of the dress and also upside down, as seen here. Hopefully seeing it here, it makes a little bit more sense. I found this easiest since I didn't have to bother with trying to fold over the rounded edges along the bottom of the collar piece and then sandwich the neckline of the dress between the two collar pieces. Instead, I could sew it like this and then just flip the collar inside out or right side out and have a nice seam along that neckline. The top bra edges of the collar will be taken care of later. Another note, when pinning the collar at the center front, undo the very center pleat, then pin the collar so that one front half of the collar goes along what would be the inside of the pleat and the other goes along the outside of the pleat. You'll get a better visual of this in the next step, the step that is being shown here. But basically, you just want one pleat at the very center front to be able to come undone so that you can attach a snap there later in order to get in and out of the garment. You could also just totally skip this step and sew the collar on like normal and instead add a middle seam down the center back of the dress and the center back of the collar as well, and then add a zipper there instead, since you won't really see it when the garment is finished. However, if you do this, be sure to add seam allowance for the zipper. Once the collar is sewn on, go ahead and flip it right side out and iron it into place. Pull up the two halves of the collar, or the outside layer and the lining layer, so that they meet at the top, and then iron them flat in order to make sure that they are sitting even with one another. Also pin them together as you iron to help them stay in place for the next step. And I only ironed from the inside, by the way, not the outside, because I didn't want to press down that embroidery too much. Here's that better look at how I had that collar working, where the pleat comes undone so that the neck hole widens so that I could take it off over my head, and then I'll just add a snap in there later to keep it closed when worn. So what I'm doing here is cutting away a bit of loose threads, a bit of the fraying fabric, and then I'm also going in and cutting that inner section of the pleat that you're not going to see from the outside into a bit of a V shape, just because I found that that helped me when placing the bias keep the shape that the collar needs to have, where it comes to like a V shape or a kind of point. And so I just add that in, and then the bias tape will be pleated as well after it's sewn into place. Basically, I needed the bias tape to come to a point in the shirt overall, including in the inner section of the pleat, so that when it was pleated, it came to a point near like the top of the collar where the collars meet. I was finding that if I just like kept it straight, it was kind of bunching up too much, or like a little bit too bulky right where the collar was, and this was the best way for me to get it kind of thinned out and have things look a little bit more nicer, I guess. So the next step was to add the bias tape to the collar. Again, I believe this bias tape is about 1/2 inch and it is double folded, so I just sandwiched the edge of the collar piece or the neckline in between the two halves of the bias tape and pinned it into place. I start off by sewing the two middle sections of bias tape down and making sure to stitch them together at the very center where they meet in the like V part of the pleated area of the neckline. And then after that, I go ahead and repleat that section and iron it down, pressing down that bias tape, making it a part of the pleat, and then the overall collar comes and meets at a nice point, the way that Meteion's collar works. Now it was time to move on to the sleeves. To start off, I sewed the top half of the sleeves shut at their seam, at like the side, under, bottom seam, whatever you want to call it, just the seam that I am showing here. Then I use my iron to press those seams open so that it looks a bit nicer on the inside. Next, I pin the sleeves to the dress and then sew that into place. Well, only the top half. The bottom half of the sleeves still shouldn't be attached at this point. I mean, I guess I could if you really wanted them to, I just hadn't attached them at this point. Next, I gathered the bottom of the top half of the sleeve. To do this, I just hand sewed a wide stitch across the very bottom and then pulled out one end of the thread to gather the fabric. Set that aside for now. Moving on to the armbands. I measured around my elbow when it's bent and then cut out 4 rectangles that were a bit longer than that measurement, both for the seam allowance and a little bit of wiggle room, and they were about 1.5 to 2 inches wide. I placed the right sides together and pinned along the 2 longest edges and then sewed along those 2 longest edges. So you should have a tube at this point, basically a flat tube of 2 armband pieces. There should no longer be 4 separate pieces, there should be 2 sewn together pieces. Turn the armbands right side out and then iron them flat. Be sure that the seam stays at the top and bottom of the armband, by the way. You don't want them to start like twisting towards the center when you're ironing them, so just go in there and kind of stretch the fabric and pull those seams out a little bit before ironing over a section. Next, fold each armband in half and sew the open edge shut. Trim off the excess fabric past the seam that you just made and go over that edge with a zigzag stitch to keep it from fraying. Next, I'm taking my pieces for the gathered section that's on the lower half of the sleeves, placing 2 and 2 right sides together. One of the layers is for the outer layer and the other one is for the lining layer. And then I'm sewing those together along the curved edge. So you should have 2 of these like half dome pieces at the end. Take that piece, turn it right side out, and then iron it nice and flat. After that, I'm taking the pieces for the bottom layer of the bottom half of the sleeves and sewing each one together along what will be the top edge, or the edge without the little flappy bit for the cuffs. There is another layer that will need to be sewn on top of this one before we can sew the other side together, so only sew that one edge and then set it aside for the next step. Make sure when you're pinning these together that your sleeves are mirroring each other. Next, press open those seams with an iron. At this point, I've went ahead and done the embroidery on the top layer of the bottom half of the sleeve off camera. I did it the exact same way as the collar pieces, where I didn't cut out my pieces until after the embroidery was done, and I used a back stitch-like stitch to sew over my guidelines that I had drawn on. Now I'm taking some bias tape and sewing that along the top edges. I start by doing one side of each point and then coming back in after that and doing the other sides to finish it off. Now I'm using my pattern piece to help with the placement of this top layer. There's more extra fabric around some of the edges of the top layer since I needed to roll it over twice to create a nice hem, and that'll encase the raw edges of the layer under it. I didn't want both layers to have to be rolled over twice because it would start to look a little too bulky for my liking, so I did it this way. So for that reason, I can't just line the top layer up with the bottom layer's edge. Instead, I have to use my pattern piece as a guideline to make sure that both sleeves look the same and have the same placement of this top layer. Be sure to account for any seam allowance that you might have added as well. Once you're happy with the placement, go ahead and pin it in place and then top stitch along the very top edge of the top layer to attach everything and keep it in place. Here, I'm just quickly trying it on to make sure that everything is fitting how I like before sewing the top layer into place. Once the top layer is attached, you can go ahead and fold the sleeves back in half, right sides together, and sew the other edge that we had left open earlier shut. Don't sew past the little flappy bits though, only the upper part of that edge should be sewn shut. Then you can press that seam open with an iron. After that, I made a little snip in the upper inner corner of each flap to help fold over the fabric a bit easier, and started double folding over all of the raw edges. There should be a small flap-like piece on one side and a large one on the other. The smallest should be folded inward so that it creates a straight edge, and the largest one needs to stay a flap, so don't fold it too far inwards. Instead, just fold over all of the edges of that flap to create a nice like hem there and keep it from fraying. This larger flap is the piece that's going to like tuck into and under the other side of the sleeve and connects to snaps that will be sewn on the inside of that other side of the sleeve. You'll see this in a little bit, but hopefully it'll make sense. I folded over one edge of the largest flap at a time and then sewed it down before moving on to the next edge of it, just because I found that easiest. Don't bother with the bottom edge of the sleeve for now. That will be taken care of in a later step. Here I'm folding over the smaller flap, and this is what I was talking about earlier about how only the top layer will fold over twice and the bottom layer's raw edge will be encased in that. Be sure to fold this over so that it creates an even straight edge that lines up with the seam you sewed to sew the upper half of this side of the sleeve shut, like the seam that we had just sewed before this step. Then sew that down. Taking a needle and thread, I hand stitched a wide running stitch, I believe it's called, along the top of the gathered arm piece from earlier. The gathered arm piece that is not yet gathered, but it is intended to be and will be. I folded that piece in half to find the center back and marked it with a clip. Then I lined that center marking up with the center back seam of the sleeve and pinned them together. Then I wrapped the gather piece around to the front of the sleeve, lined those front edges up with the center front seam on the sleeve, and pinned them together. After that, I pulled at either end of the thread that ran along the top of the gathered piece to gather the fabric, stopping once it just fit around the sleeve. Be careful not to pull it too tight because you don't want to tighten the sleeve. Your goal is to gather the fabric so that the top of the gathered piece is the same size as the top of the opening on the sleeve. Pin or clip those pieces together. By the way, I do all the pinning at the center seams and such first in order to make the gather more even. Next, I hand sewed the gather piece to the sleeve along the very top. It doesn't need to be super secure or anything and should be sewn up high enough where you won't see it later, so sew in your seam allowance area. This is just to help keep it in place when pinning the bottom half of the sleeve to the armband later, since I'll have to remove those clips in order to do that, and I don't want things just kind of coming unraveled. I wrapped the armbands around the top of the sleeve so that it just fit in the same way that I did with the gathered piece, and marked where the seam should be. I also tried it on to make sure that it did actually fit okay, like the entire sleeve, and that I could still like bend my elbow and move around. Go ahead and sew that seam shut following the line that you have marked as well. Here's just a quick look at the way the back of the sleeves fold over one another. Anyways, originally I had included seam allowance to double fold over the bottom edge of the sleeves, but I decided to use bias tape instead because I just liked how that was looking on other areas of the costume. So I went ahead and cut off the excess seam allowance. Next, I pinned the bias tape around the bottom of the sleeve and then sewed that in place. I needed the front part of the gathered piece of the sleeve to stay shut or connected to one another just a bit towards the top. After looking at reference photo, I saw that hers wasn't completely open at the top here. It was a little bit like stuck together and then started to part. So to mimic that, I used a ladder stitch and sewed an inch or like an inch and a half or so down from the top down the center, sewing like the two halves of this gathered piece together. Next, I hand sewed the armband to the top of the bottom half of the sleeve using a backstitch. Then I went ahead and gathered the bottom edge of the top half of the sleeve. We had sewed a wide stitch earlier, but I had set it aside, so I did that off camera, and I just gathered the end the edge, I guess, by pulling on those threads, and I gathered it so that it was just tight enough to fit into the armband, but not too tight that it was making that opening any smaller. Like, it should just fit in there nicely, I guess. Then I pinned those two pieces together and started hand sewing. I'm hand sewing this part on because it was just such a small area and it's like a circle. I couldn't really get it into my machine, and then there was so much fabric on top of that I would have to constantly move around to make sure I wasn't sewing through other sections of fabric. It was just too much to bother with, so I decided to hand sew the armband on entirely. And again, I used a backstitch for this to make sure that it was extra secure. I also made sure that the seam of my armband lined up with the back seam or the seam on the underside of both of the halves of the sleeves. So this is a different way of filming than I normally film. I just wanted to do a very quick kind of update inserted into the middle of this sewing video to kind of show you guys what the dress is currently looking like. It is very shapeless because I have not inserted the elastic band, but the sleeves are on. I can't quite bend my arms right now because all of the excess from the gathered parts are just stuffing the elbow section. Once I cut that out, it'll be fine. I just wanted to check to make sure that everything was sitting where it should and the sleeves were the right length and everything. And now that I can see that they are, I can go ahead and cut away the excess in the little elbow band area so that I can actually start bending my arms normally again. Other than that, everything is fitting great. All that I need to do is to fix this shoulder right here, just because the shoulder section for me, while it fit my mannequin, was a little bit too long, and that seam, if you can see it, it drapes slightly off my shoulder. My shoulder is right here. All I'm going to do is pull this up and obviously when it's inside out, pin it and sew it and then cut away the excess, because that's honestly what's going to be easier. This will lift the poof up a little bit and it will have a much nicer shape. I've already pulled it up and tested it out. I'm going to mark my waistline because I have not done that. I'm going to put this on inside out, take a piece of fabric chalk and draw a rough line across where my waist is, and then I'll use a ruler to straighten out that line, but I just need a rough guideline so that I can see exactly where I'm going to need to sew the elastic band on and get that sewn into place. So that is what you'll see coming up next. But yeah, I'm really happy with how this is looking. The sleeves are sitting how they're supposed to. Oh, I'm also going to go ahead and gather this bottom section and just kind of stitch it into place to hold it up a little bit higher as well before I do the elastic band. But anyways, besides that, I'm pretty happy. This is looking pretty good. Here I'm cutting away the excess fabric in the sleeves. There's so much excess because before sewing together the sleeves, I tried them on and adjusted the length of a couple different pieces. So some of them, originally they were a bit too long, so I'd pulled them up and further into the armband, and that's where all this extra fabric came from. Next, I did what I mentioned I was going to do earlier and pinned up the sleeves to sew a new seam line to just take them up a bit and pull up the poof and make the shoulders actually sit on my shoulders. And I just sewed that down. Next, I gathered the bottom edge of the gathered piece of the sleeves. I just kind of eyeballed where I wanted the gathered section to start and end, and I would gather it with my hands first just to see what looked good, and then made a little marking or even a mental note on where one end should start and where it should end. Once I did have those spots figured out, I went ahead and sewed a wide running stitch, I believe that's what it's called, along that bottom edge from one side to the other. I tried to keep this stitch in the seam, by the way, so I didn't like sew through the front and the back of the fabric, but rather through the stitches in the seam. I started the stitch off with a knot at one end, and when I got to the other end, I just pulled on the thread to gather the fabric. After that, I cut out a piece of elastic that fits snugly around my waist. If you have a lot of fabric, if your dress is really wide like mine was, you might need to cut the elastic to be a bit bigger than that, just to make sure that it can stretch to the length of the waist of the dress when it's like not gathered or bunched up. Anyways, once you have your elastic, fold it in half and then mark where the center is, then unfold it and pin one end to the open side of Meteion's dress. I should also note at this point that if you have attached the sleeves first, like I did, you will need to sew that side shut just a little bit from like the top down to a bit above the waistline so that you can attach the sleeves. Although you don't have to attach the sleeves first, you can wait until after this step or last. I just had to do it in this order in order to figure out exactly what I was doing and make sure that things were working right and make adjustments to like my patterns and stuff as I was going along. It was a whole process, so this is the order I ended up doing it in. But going back, I would have attached the sleeves last. Anyways, pin the center of the elastic at the seam on the opposite side, the side that is stitched closed. Then wrap the elastic around the back of the dress and pin the other end of the elastic back at the open side again, but like on the back. It should make like a loop almost. And you're pinning all this at wherever you marked your waistline to be. I also went ahead and, while stretching the elastic to the size of the dress's waist, pinned it along my waistline marking every couple of inches just to keep it in place and make it a bit easier when sewing. Using a wide zigzag stitch, I sewed directly on top of the elastic, stretching it so that it laid flat with the fabric and nothing was being gathered as I went along. When you're done, the elastic should snap back to roughly how it was before being stretched, and it will take the fabric with it, creating a gather around the entire waist. And this is how it looks when you're finished with that step. It will be seen, like the zigzag stitching will be seen from the outside. It shouldn't be a big deal though, because you shouldn't see this when you have the full cosplay on, as the belt will cover the waistline. Next, I finished sewing shut that open side of the dress. After that, I double folded over the raw edge of the bottom of the dress to create a nice hem, and then I ironed it just to make the sewing process a little bit easier and pinned that to keep everything in place as well, or I use these sewing clips, but same thing. And then I sewed that down using a straight stitch. However, I didn't get footage of the actual sewing. Not that the footage or angle that I have in this video is ideal. I'll probably switch that up in future videos. I mean, I most definitely will switch that up in future videos. Then I ironed the dress once again just to press that hem down really nicely after I've sewn it and press open the side seam that I had just recently sewn shut as well. There's a lot of ironing. Basically, you want to pretty much iron after every step if you want to keep your garment looking nice both inside and out. After that, it was time for closures and small details. I started off by sewing the snaps to the sleeves. I used snaps instead of buttons because buttons and buttonholes would have messed with the embroidery that I had already done. So snaps was the way to go. I marked where I wanted the snaps to be, pinned them in place, and then hand sewed them down. There's 2 on each sleeve, one at the top of the opening and one towards the bottom. I applied fray check over all of the stitching on the snaps on both the front and back sides, as long as the back sides were actually accessible, because when I sewed the snaps that attached to the outer side of the sleeves, I only sewed through the inner layer, not all the way through the top, because I didn't want the stitching showing on the outside. On the inner one, I didn't care, so I just sewed through both the front or top and bottom layers because you're not going to see that anyways. But anyways, I used fray check here just as a sort of sealer almost, or like a glue to keep the stitching from like unraveling and the little knots that I tied from coming undone. Meteion does have buttons on her sleeves that are visible like in the game art and her model and whatnot, so I did sew on some decorative non-functional buttons to the outside of the sleeves. There's 3 on each one, although the top one does get tucked under and kind of hidden by the gathered piece. You can see the bottom too though. I also want to note that I did hand sew the gathered piece to the sleeve in the back. I only used a few loops of stitchings here and there and sewed it to only one side of the sleeve so that I could still open and shut the cuffs. This was just to keep it in place because without being just kind of stitched to the sleeve, it would just like flop down when you like raised your arms or something. And the last thing I did that I don't have footage of was sew a small snap to the part of the neckline where the pleats come undone and open up that I had shown earlier in the video, and I just sewed it so that the snaps were tucked in between, or the one snap was tucked in between the pleat, so you can't see it from the outside, but it's there just kind of keeping it shut. There's not a lot of tension in that area, so it doesn't need to be a very heavy duty snap, so I just picked one that was small enough to fit in that pleated section, so it just needs to be smaller than ½ inch. And that's it. The dress is done. I'm really happy with this, how this turned out. I like that I didn't need to add a zipper anywhere, but just by hiding a snap under the pleats, I'm able to take it on and off pretty easily. I think the dress turned out pretty cute. It's super ruffly, super gathered, super poofy, just like hers. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it for this. I hope you guys found this video helpful. Thanks for watching. Have a lovely day and bye!